Come, let me tell you a story. Tales of wonder, tales of light and dark.
What the hell is that? I love you. Don't you see?
There are all manner of stories here, for I am the arm.
BPM by Samuel Dunton. Tom hadn't always been bothered by the sounds of his own heartbeat. When he thought back to his childhood and all the different sports he played, he'd had no memory of any discomfort or worry. Football, cricket, basketball down the Gildridge, sailing and windsurfing on Saturday with Lawrence. Even just charging about the park with his brother, his heart would pound away like a jackhammer, an unstoppable and infallible powerhouse for all the energy he needed. Until he started smoking cigarettes at 15, then weed at 16, then drinking booze at 17. Even then, though, these milestones never really called his attention to his BPM. It wasn't until he dropped his first bomb of MDMA at Brighton's Pride event in 2011. But once again, it wasn't what he ingested that drew his attention to his chest. A mere half an hour after dropping the small Rizzler-wrapped rock before entering the event, he could feel it. He was coming up. He was finally someone who rolled, who tripped, who raved. He pounded the air with his fists, perfectly out of time with the music he felt pulsating through the ground. But then he stopped. A memory dislodged itself from the recesses of his mind. Perhaps the deluge of serotonin rushing to be released had opened the floodgates on half-forgotten hazy experiences. He was 9 and sprinting through the children's play area at a castle in the southeast. Spotting his grandfather at the far end, he sprinted towards him and jumped into his arms. "Christ, is he all right, love? His heart's going like a rabbit across a field." Like a rabbit across a field. Like a rabbit across a field. These words ran through Tom's mind over and over as he grabbed his chest. Was his heart beating too fast? He did feel lightheaded. Was that the music in his ears, or blood rushing through them? He knew then he was done for, and he was. Over the next few years, Tom became obsessed with his heart. Not enough to change his behaviour or lifestyle, of course. He still smoked, drank, snorted, and swallowed anything vaguely intoxicating. But he was always transfixed by his heartbeat. Christ, did it just stop for a few seconds? Oh, mate, it absolutely skipped a few beats there, I know it. My right arm hurts. That's the bad one, right? The one to worry about? It didn't matter what he was doing or where he was. Hand to chest, always checking, always counting. If it was between 10 and 18 beats per 10 seconds, he was all right. Any higher, then, oh boy, Tom was freaking out. It got to the point where he was scared to move for fear of elevation in his BPM. Which brings us to today. Tom hadn't left the house in 2 weeks. He had lost his job months ago as he spent more time counting beats than timing meats. He was a carvery chef. Or was, rather. He had to go to the shop for cigarettes. He'd run out. He stepped out his front door and proceeded to take one step at a time. Step, check the heart, all good. Step, check. Step, check. This continued from his front door all the way up the street. Tom reaching a crossing, he took a step, check, step, check, step. Hang on. What's that? Christ. A palpitation? A murmur? A skip? Oh my God. It's the big one. The HA. The heart attack. He knew. He'd known for years. Still, he couldn't believe it. 25 years old, and he was dying of a heart attack. There was so much he never did. All these years frittered away. He could have travelled, fallen in love, learnt to drive. But no, His heart's packed up the car, and it's off to the grave. See you, world. It was not... Oh. Hang on. There it is. Tom pulled his hand from his chest quickly, then returned it. Yes, there it is, clear as day, thumping away like a rabbit across a field. Tom was so happy, so relieved, so deliriously ecstatic, he didn't even notice when the newly passed teenage driver ran his Corsa right through him at 80 miles an hour. He was killed instantly. When the coroners came to retrieve the body from the scene of the accident, they noticed a wallet nearby in the street. It was Tom's. It had been thrown from his pocket as his broken body tumbled through the air. There wasn't any money, of course, just a bent debit card covered with a white residue. And an organ donor card. That's good, said the coroner as they wheeled him into the ambulance. The rest of him's fucked, but his heart should be good to go. The Deep End by Samuel Dunton. Charlie loved to swim. Always had. As soon as he was deemed old enough by his mum Susan, Charlie was straight down the local swimming centre for lessons. He quickly soared through the classes, quick as a flash. Took to it like a duck, like a fish even. He could hold his breath for at least a minute and a half, far longer than anyone, even twice his age. Susan said his lungs were so strong from all the time he spent crying as a baby. But Charlie knew it was because he was born to swim. He was just a swimmer, plain and simple. By the time he was 12 years old, Charlie was down the swimming centre every day, straight there after school, all day Saturday and Sunday. He loved it. He loved the lap pools where he could swim up and down, constantly trying out his new strokes and testing his breath capacity. He loved the diving pool, flipping off the high board and plunging right down to the depths of the pool. Usually, you had to be older than Charlie to use the diving pool, but all the staff at the centre knew and liked Charlie. They knew he could handle it. He loved the little jacuzzi that overlooked the main pool, where he could look down at everyone else having fun. He loved the curly fries he ate in the centre's cafe, soaked in vinegar and ketchup. He even liked smelling like chlorine every time he left. It made him feel clean. But what Charlie loved the most was the main pool, because every half an hour, the waves started. It was a simple enough process. A siren would ring out and a lifeguard would speak into a microphone in a silly voice telling everyone,
"It's time to get wavy."
Then whatever upbeat pop song that was in the charts at the time would play for the next 2 minutes as ever increasing waves rocked the pool. Charlie loved the waves. He loved swimming against them. Starting at the shallow end, he'd make it his mission to swim the whole length of the pool so he could ride the last and biggest waves into the deep end. At the deep end was a wall, but if you went underwater, you could see a section of metal bars blocking off an empty tiled area where the waves came out from. Charlie would hold his breath, hold onto the bars, and ride the waves underwater, riding the last and biggest wave out back onto the surface of the water. It was simply the best thing ever, Charlie thought. It made him feel like his favourite superhero, Aquaman. Charlie's favourite person to come to the swimming centre with was his dad, Tom. But for some reason, Tom had not been at home much lately. Charlie had often woken up in the night to sounds of his parents arguing in the next room, and by morning, Tom was already away to work by the time Charlie came downstairs. Tom always took Charlie on Saturdays and Sundays. He would sit in the shallow end of the pool and interact and play with Charlie as much or as little as he wanted. Until this Saturday. Until today. Today, Charlie's mum Susan took Charlie to the swimming centre, saying that Dad was dealing with some stuff at work today. Charlie knew that wasn't true. He had seen the empty cupboards and wardrobes in their bedroom that morning. Charlie knew that after swimming, something was going to happen. Things were going to change. Charlie arrived at the pool and went straight for the lap pool. He wanted something structured, a routine to keep these new and bad thoughts from his mind. He started off with a breaststroke, easily completing 10 laps in a few minutes. There was no change, so he headed to the dive pool, climbed up the ladder, jumped off the board, dove deep into the depths of the pool. Not even the rush of air filling his ears from the dive, or the sudden shock of the cold, deep water could dispel these bad thoughts. Charlie went to the jacuzzi and sat in the warm ripples and bubbles. He watched the raging swell of jets create and destroy hundreds of bubbles, but they couldn't do the same for the thoughts in his mind. And then he heard something that pulled him from his thoughts. He heard the siren. He heard the lifeguard.
It's time to get wavy.
Charlie smiled. The wave pool. The waves would save him. Charlie quickly exited the jacuzzi, running on the slippery tiled floor to the shallow end of the pool. He looked to where his father Tom was usually sat, for a brief moment expecting to see his smiling face, ready to join him. He wasn't there. Another father was, splashing his toddlers gently, laughing. Charlie kept running. The lifeguard shouted into the microphone, "Sir runs a lot. No running. I've told you before." All the lifeguards knew and liked Charlie. He smiled and waved, slowing down as he reached the shallow end. The waves began. Charlie stood still at first, allowing the first gentle waves to hit and crash against his knees. But after a moment, he headed deeper into the water. He swam against the growing waves. Every time one wave crested, he was met with another father, another son, another happy family playing. Charlie swam faster and harder into the steadily bigger oncoming waves. The lifeguard watched Charlie, wondering where the boy's father was. They always came together on the weekends. Charlie reached the deep end of the pool in record time. He placed his hands against the wall and steadied himself. He took a deep breath and went under. He looked through the bars he had looked through 1,000 times before, expecting to see the same empty, cavernous area of tiles. Instead, he saw what looked like a boy his own age, floating, motionless. Charlie shouted under the water, a torrent of bubbles releasing from his mouth as a large wave buffeted him back from the bars. Charlie swam upwards and, breaking the surface, pointed at the wall, shouting at the lifeguard. "There's someone in there!" The lifeguard caught sight of Charlie. Crazy kid, he thought. He does love those waves. Charlie waved frantically, but he knew the lifeguard couldn't hear him over the sound of the music. Taking a big lungful of air, Charlie submerged himself once again. He swam downwards towards the bars and looked for the floating boy. He had floated further into the tiled room. Charlie waited. Every wave that flowed through the bars made a powerful pull as it went back. Charlie would have to time the wave just right to get through. He waited. The wave pulsated outwards, pushing him back, and then, tightening himself, Charlie was pulled through the bars. Charlie moved quickly. He swam for the boy with quick, rapid strokes. He had at least a minute of breath left. He swam and swam until he reached the boy. He reached out and grabbed him, turning him around. He was met with his own face. Charlie screamed, a noiseless, wordless scream. He watched the bubbles escape from his mouth and obscure this doppelganger as it too disappeared into bubbles. Charlie was terrified. What was happening? He swam quickly back to the bars and waited for the wave that would grant him his escape. None came. No, surely it wasn't over. Charlie panicked. He pulled at the bars, desperately trying to squeeze through them, but to no avail. How could this happen? He was a swimmer. He was practically a fish, yet here he was, about to drown. He cried tears that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Charlie just wanted to go back to swimming in the shallow end, go back to playing with his dad. As he let water into his lungs and his vision faded, Charlie wondered if his mum had even noticed he'd gone. Charlie awoke, coughing and spluttering harsh chlorine water from his lungs. He gasped for breath as he saw a crowd of concerned parents and entertained children. The lifeguard was holding him. "Are you all right, mate?" he asked, fear for this child's life and his own employment in his eyes. Charlie nodded weakly. Susan arrived, screaming and shouting, threats of civil action and people losing their jobs. Charlie turned away from the crowd and the noise and looked to the water of the pool a metre away from him. He watched the waves slowly rise and retreat. He heard his father shouting in the distance. He smiled. Maybe he'll stay now. Maybe it'll be better. Maybe it'll be like it was. Maybe they'll swim together like they used to, in the shallow end of the pool.